Emily Ross had always envisioned a picture-perfect life. Growing up in a small town, she believed in the fairy tales she had heard countless times. Find love, settle down, have children, and live happily ever after. She thought she had found that when she married David, her high school sweetheart. They were inseparable, best friends and lovers, the couple everyone in their town admired. David was charming, with a steady job in finance, and Emily, a talented graphic designer, was content working freelance from their cozy home in the suburbs. For years, their lives followed the expected path. They bought a modest house with a white picket fence, took weekend trips to the coast, and planned for their future family. Both were eager to have children, and when Emily finally became pregnant, they were ecstatic. They decorated a nursery, eagerly awaiting the arrival of their baby, oblivious to the storm looming ahead. When the pregnancy progressed, Emily and David received a shock during the ultrasound. She wasn't expecting just one baby, but 3. Triplets. It was unexpected, but after the initial shock wore off, they were thrilled. They marveled at the idea of having 3 babies, imagining the joy and chaos of raising them together. David joked about needing a bigger car, and Emily fantasized about the matching outfits she would dress the babies in. Life felt full of promise. The day of the delivery was supposed to be the happiest of their lives. Emily was in labor for hours, enduring the pain with David by her side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. When the triplets were born, the room filled with the sound of tiny cries. Exhausted but elated, Emily waited to hold her babies, expecting the surge of joy that everyone talked about. But the moment the nurses brought her the babies, the atmosphere in the room shifted. David, who had been beaming moments before, suddenly froze. His face turned ashen as he stared at the babies, Noah, Isaiah, and Layla, all of whom had dark skin and features that neither Emily nor David possessed. Emily's mind raced. She looked at the babies, then at David. Confusion etched on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked, but David didn't respond. He stood up, his hands trembling as he backed away from the bed. "What is this, Emily?" David's voice was low but sharp, disbelief and anger clashing in his eyes. How could you?" His words hung in the air, accusation, and hurt evident in every syllable. Emily felt her heart drop. "David, I don't know. I swear, I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the crying newborns. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't know what to say. The babies were hers. She had carried them for 9 long months. How could this be happening? David didn't wait for an explanation. He stormed out of the delivery room without looking back, leaving Emily alone with the triplets and the crushing weight of his abandonment. In the following days, Emily's confusion turned to devastation. She begged David to talk to her, to give her a chance to explain what even she couldn't comprehend. But he wouldn't listen. The man who had once been her rock now acted like a stranger, avoiding her at all costs. Even when he visited the hospital, it was brief and filled with cold silence. Emily felt his distance grow with each passing day. By the time she was discharged, David had packed his belongings and left their home. He filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The rumors spread quickly through their tight-knit community. Friends turned away, their curiosity and judgment evident in the way they whispered behind Emily's back. Alone with the triplets, whom she named Noah, Isaiah, and Layla, Emily had no answers, only questions. She struggled to comprehend how her life had gone from perfect to unrecognizable in a matter of days. DNA tests confirmed what Emily knew in her heart. The babies were biologically hers and David's. The doctors explained it as a rare genetic anomaly, something to do with distant ancestry that had resurfaced in an unexpected way. It was an explanation, but it did nothing to heal the gaping hole left in Emily's life. The pain of David's departure, coupled with the whispers from her neighbors and even her own family's disapproval, weighed heavily on her. Emily's parents, conservative and set in their ways, were uncomfortable with her situation, visiting sparingly and offering little help. They loved her but couldn't understand or accept the reality of the triplets' appearance, leaving Emily more isolated than ever. Each day was a struggle as Emily learned to care for 3 infants on her own. Sleepless nights blurred into exhausting days. Feeding, changing diapers, and soothing her babies became her entire existence. The lack of support, both emotional and physical, took its toll, and there were nights when Emily felt like she couldn't go on. She would look at her babies, their innocent faces gazing up at her, and wonder how she could ever give them the life they deserved. Despite her exhaustion and the heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm her, Emily knew she had no choice but to keep going. Noah, Isaiah, and Layla were her lifeline. They were hers, regardless of what anyone said or thought. Every time they smiled or cooed at her, Emily's heart swelled with love and determination. In the months that followed, Emily's resilience began to surface. Though she still grieved the loss of her marriage and the life she thought she would have, she slowly started to piece together a new one. It wasn't easy. Money was tight, and she often had to rely on government assistance to make ends meet. Her freelance work, which had once been a source of pride, now felt like an afterthought in the whirlwind of motherhood. But Emily was nothing if not strong. She would take the babies for walks in the park, ignoring the curious stares from passers-by, and remind herself that she had to be enough for them. She had to be mother and father, protector and provider, even if she was still learning how. The hardest part, though, was the loneliness. Every night, when the babies were finally asleep, Emily would sit in the nursery, listening to the sound of their breathing, and feel the weight of her solitude. She missed David terribly, despite his abandonment. She missed the comfort of their life together, the laughter they had shared, the future they had planned. But that life was gone, and Emily knew that she had to forge a new one that didn't include David, even if her heart hadn't fully let him go. In the darkest moments, when the tears wouldn't stop, Emily would remind herself that she had survived the unthinkable. She had given birth to 3 beautiful children, and though their arrival had shattered her world, they had also given her a new purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than she had ever imagined, and she would rise, because she had to, for them. Months passed, and the harsh reality of single motherhood weighed heavily on Emily. Each day felt like an endless cycle of feeding, changing, and comforting 3 infants, all while navigating her own heartbreak. The once vibrant woman who had been filled with dreams of a happy family was now a shadow of herself. The house, which she and David had lovingly renovated, felt cold and empty, save for the constant cries of the triplets. The few friends she had were now distant, unable or unwilling to understand her new reality. Emily's parents, while well-meaning, were more concerned with appearances, constantly hinting that maybe it was time to move back home or seek professional help. Emily was alone, navigating this unfamiliar terrain with no map, no guide. Yet, amidst all of this chaos, one thing remained constant: her neighbor, Chris. Chris lived next door in the small, unassuming house he had inherited from his parents. He was quiet, the kind of neighbor who waved but didn't pry. Emily had known him for years, but their interactions had been few and far between. He was a carpenter by trade, often working odd hours, and spent his weekends renovating his house or tending to his modest garden. Chris was kind in a way that didn't demand attention. He existed quietly, without judgment, and it was his very nature that made him invaluable to Emily during her darkest days. At first, Chris's help was subtle. A package delivered to her door when Emily didn't have the energy to pick it up, a trash bin rolled out on collection day, a fresh loaf of bread left on her porch. Emily appreciated these small acts of kindness, but she was too proud to ask for more. She had always been fiercely independent, and even though her life had crumbled around her, that part of her hadn't changed. But Chris seemed to have an instinct for when someone needed help, even when they weren't asking for it. One rainy afternoon, when Emily was struggling to wrangle the triplets into their car seats, drenched and on the verge of tears, Chris appeared out of nowhere. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded, too tired to refuse. He helped strap the babies into the car with ease, moving swiftly and efficiently as if he had done it 100 times before. Once the triplets were secure, Chris gave her a small, comforting smile. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Emily thanked him, though she doubted she ever would. She was still wary of letting anyone too close. Life had taught her that people, even those who promised to stay, often left. David's abandonment had cut deeper than she cared to admit, and while she appreciated Chris's help, she wasn't ready to let him or anyone into her world. But Chris didn't press. His help remained small, unobtrusive, and always when Emily needed it most. He'd shovel her driveway after a snowstorm, mow her lawn in the summer, and offer to pick up groceries when she was overwhelmed. Slowly, Emily found herself relying on these gestures, though she still resisted reaching out first. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Emily was on the front porch, trying to get some air after a particularly exhausting day. Noah was teething, Layla had developed a stubborn streak, and Isaiah was prone to fits of crying for no apparent reason. She felt utterly defeated, her nerves frayed beyond repair. That's when Chris walked over, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you could use one," he said, handing her a cup. She smiled weakly. "You have no idea." They sat in silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in ages: comfort. "I don't know how you do it," Chris said quietly, breaking the silence. 3 babies on your own. I'd be a wreck." "I am a wreck," Emily admitted with a humorless laugh. "Most days, I don't even know how I make it through." Chris turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You're stronger than you think." Emily shrugged, unsure of how to respond, but his words lingered in the back of her mind, replaying themselves long after he'd gone home. Could it be true? Was she really strong, or was she just surviving, barely hanging on? Over the next few weeks, Chris's presence became more frequent, though never intrusive. He would stop by to check on the kids, offer to help with little repairs around the house, or bring over dinner when he noticed she hadn't eaten all day. It was these small acts of kindness that slowly began to break down the walls Emily had built around herself. Then, one evening, Chris did something that took Emily by surprise. It had been a particularly rough day. The triplets were fussy, and Emily was emotionally drained. After putting the kids to bed, she collapsed on the couch, too exhausted to move. That's when she heard a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Chris standing there with a toolbox in hand. "Your front door's been sticking for a while. Mind if I fix it?" Emily blinked, surprised. Sure, go ahead." While Chris worked on the door, Emily watched him, marveling at how comfortable he seemed in the chaos of her life. There was something calming about him, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he never asked for more than she was willing to give. When he finished, Chris turned to her, wiping his hands on a rag. "There's something else I want to ask you," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how much she had started to care about Chris until that moment, and the possibility that he might ask something of her, something she wasn't ready to give, made her nervous. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Chris smiled, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "I know things have been hard for you, and I don't want to overstep, but I've grown really fond of your kids. I'd like to help out more, if you'll let me." Emily's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever offered to help like that before, not without strings attached, not without expecting something in return. She wanted to say yes, but the fear of letting someone in, of relying on someone again, held her back. "I don't know, Chris," she said softly. "I'm not sure I can." "I'm not asking for anything in return," Chris interrupted gently. "I just want to be there for you and the kids. You don't have to do this alone." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time in months, Emily felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Okay, From that moment on, Chris became an integral part of their lives. He was there for everything. The late-night feedings, the temper tantrums, the moments when Emily felt like she couldn't take another step. He became a father figure to the triplets, who adored him, and a source of strength for Emily, who had never known such selfless support. But as their bond deepened, Emily began to feel something she hadn't expected: guilt. Though Chris had never pushed her, she knew he had feelings for her, feelings she wasn't sure she could reciprocate. Her heart was still wounded from David's betrayal, and she wasn't ready to open herself up to the possibility of love again. Yet Chris's presence in her life had become so essential that the thought of losing him terrified her. Then came the twist Emily hadn't seen coming. One evening, while Chris was helping Emily put the kids to bed, there was a knock at the door. Emily frowned, confused. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, her heart nearly stopped. Standing there, after more than 2 years of complete silence, was David. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "I need to talk to you." Chris, who had been coming down the stairs, froze when he saw David standing in the doorway. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment no one moved. Emily's mind raced. What was David doing here? Why now? After everything, her heart pounded in her chest, torn between the man who had left her and the man who had stayed. I don't know what to say," she stammered, glancing nervously at Chris. David's eyes softened. "I was wrong, Emily. I've had a lot of time to think, and I want to be part of your life again. I want to be part of our kids' lives." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Emily felt the world shift beneath her feet. Everything she had built, everything Chris had helped her build, was now in jeopardy. And for the first time since David had left, Emily didn't know what to do. She glanced at Chris, who stood quietly at the base of the stairs, his face unreadable. And in that moment, Emily realized that the biggest choice of her life was now in front of her. Was it too late to go back? Or had she already found her new beginning, right in front of her all along? The answer wasn't clear, and the stakes had never been higher. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. The sight of David, her ex-husband, the man who had walked out on her without looking back, was like a punch to the gut. The air between them was thick with tension, and the weight of his unexpected return was suffocating. David had always been handsome, with his chiseled features and calm demeanor. But now, standing on her doorstep after 2 years of absence, there was something different about him. His eyes, once full of warmth and familiarity, were now tinged with regret and desperation. Behind her, Chris hovered near the staircase, his expression unreadable. Emily could feel his presence, solid and reassuring, a stark contrast to the swirling emotions that David's sudden reappearance had unleashed. "David, why are you here?" Emily finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she wanted the answer. This man had broken her in ways she hadn't even realized until long after he had left. He had taken not just her heart but her sense of trust, her belief in love and loyalty. And now, here he was, standing before her as if he could erase the past with an apology. David took a tentative step forward, but Emily instinctively recoiled. He stopped, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said softly, his voice cracking. "I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you, but I've changed. I'm not the same man I was when I left." Emily's heart clenched. She wanted to scream at him, to demand where he had been all this time when she had needed him most, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind flashed back to those early days after he had left. The night she had cried herself to sleep, the endless loneliness of raising 3 newborns without a partner. "I don't understand, David," she said, finally finding her voice. "You walked out on me, on us. You left without a word, and now you just show up? What do you want?" David looked down, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed the back of his neck. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "When I saw the babies, I panicked. It wasn't rational, but I couldn't handle it. I didn't know how to process it, and I ran. I know it's no excuse, but I was a coward. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Hearing him admit what she had known all along did little to soften the blow. A coward, she repeated bitterly. You left your own children because you were scared? Do you have any idea what you put us through? What I went through? David's eyes filled with tears. I know, he said, his voice breaking. And I've regretted it every single day. I've been in therapy, Emily. I've been working on myself, trying to understand why I did what I did. And I want to make things right. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Torn between the anger she had carried for so long and the small flicker of compassion that still lingered in her heart for the man she had once loved. I don't know if you can ever make this right, she said finally, her voice trembling. You can't just walk back into my life and expect things to go back to the way they were. David nodded, swallowing hard. I don't expect that. I just want a chance to be part of their lives. Noah, Isaiah, and Layla. I want to be their father. Please, Emily. I need this. Emily's heart ached at the mention of the triplets. She had always known this moment might come, that one day David would return and want to be involved. But the reality of it, now that it was happening, felt impossible to navigate. Behind her, Chris shifted slightly, and Emily could sense the tension in the air. She hadn't forgotten he was there, watching this unfold, and his quiet presence grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. Chris had been her rock for so long now, and the thought of losing that stability, that connection, terrified her. I don't know, David, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You don't just get to show up and pretend the last 2 years didn't happen. David opened his mouth to respond, but Chris, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension in his words. Emily, he said softly, you don't have to make any decisions right now. Emily turned to look at Chris, and in that moment, she realized just how much he had become a part of her life. His quiet strength, his unwavering support. It was everything David had failed to be. And yet, there was a part of her that still felt a pull toward her ex-husband, a ghost of the love they had once shared. The unfinished business between them was like a wound that had never fully healed. David, sensing the shift in the room, took another step forward. I'm not asking for everything at once. I just want a chance to prove to you that I've changed, that I can be the father they deserve. Emily's head spun. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, to move on from the pain David had caused. But now, with him standing before her, the past seemed to crash down on her all over again. I can't do this right now, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I need time. David nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere this time. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the doorway, her heart pounding. The man who had once been her entire world had returned, but she no longer knew where he fit in the life she had painstakingly built. Once David was gone, the silence in the house was almost unbearable. Emily stood there, gripping the edge of the doorframe, trying to steady herself. Chris stepped forward, his expression unreadable. You okay? He asked quietly. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure she was telling the truth. I don't know, she said, her voice wavering. I don't know what to do. Chris hesitated, then reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said gently. Take it one step at a time. I'm here for whatever you need. His touch was comforting, grounding her in the present when her mind wanted to spiral back into the past. But as she stood there, the reality of her situation became clear. She had a choice to make, and no matter what she decided, someone was going to get hurt. Over the next few days, David's presence lingered like a shadow over Emily's thoughts. He texted her, asking for updates on the kids, offering to help in any way he could. But Emily was hesitant. The last time she had trusted him, he had shattered her heart. Could she risk letting him in again? Not just for herself, but for the triplets? They deserved a father, but did that mean giving David another chance? And then there was Chris. He hadn't brought up David since that night, but Emily could sense his unease. He had been nothing but patient, but she knew he must be wondering where he stood in all of this. Chris had become a fixture in their lives, a source of comfort and stability for both her and the kids. The thought of hurting him was unbearable. But how could she move forward without addressing the unresolved feelings she still had for David? The internal conflict gnawed at Emily day and night. Every time she looked at her children, she thought of David. They deserved to know their father. And yet, every time she looked at Chris, she saw the man who had stood by her side when no one else had. The breaking point came one evening when David showed up at her door again, this time unannounced. Emily had been getting the triplets ready for bed, and the sight of their father threw her off balance. The children, of course, didn't know who he was. They giggled and babbled as David stood there, his face torn between joy and regret. "Can I see them?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Emily bit her lip, unsure. But before she could answer, Noah toddled over to David, reaching out with his tiny hands. David's eyes filled with tears as he scooped his son into his arms. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad." The moment was bittersweet, and Emily felt her heart twist. She had spent so long trying to protect her children from the pain she had experienced. But now, seeing David with Noah, she realized she couldn't shield them forever. They had a right to know their father, no matter how complicated her feelings toward him were. But then came the unexpected twist. Chris arrived, just as David was cradling Noah in his arms. He had come by to help with the kids, as he often did in the evenings. When he saw David standing there, holding Noah, a look of surprise and hurt crossed his face. "Chris," Emily began, but the words stuck in her throat. Chris looked from Emily to David, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. "I see," Chris said quietly, his face unreadable. He set down the bag of groceries he had brought and turned toward the door. "Chris, wait." Emily called after him, but he didn't stop. As the door closed behind Chris, Emily's heart sank. She had just crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. The choice she had been avoiding for so long was finally staring her in the face. And no matter what she did, someone was going to get hurt. Now, she had to decide, was it the man who had left her or the man who had stayed? The echo of the door closing behind Chris reverberated through Emily's heart, leaving her standing in the living room with Noah still nestled in David's arms. The room was quiet, save for the soft babbling of her child, but the tension was palpable. Emily's mind raced, filled with questions, regrets, and the unmistakable fear that she was about to lose someone she couldn't bear to live without. The crossroads she had been avoiding for so long had finally arrived, and now she was forced to confront it head-on. David, sensing the weight of the moment, gently placed Noah back down on the floor. The triplets, oblivious to the turmoil swirling around them, continued playing, their laughter a stark contrast to the emotional storm brewing inside their mother. "Emily, I didn't mean to make things harder," David said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I didn't expect to walk in on, well, I didn't know about him." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. "It's not that simple, David," she murmured, running a hand through her hair. "You can't just come back after 2 years and expect everything to be the way it was." David shifted uncomfortably, his eyes never leaving her face. "I don't expect that. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to make things right." Emily sighed, torn between the lingering attachment to her past and the reality of her present. It was like being pulled in 2 directions, and she wasn't sure which one would lead her to peace. She glanced at her children, then back to David, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "David," she began carefully, "I understand you want to be part of their lives, but you have to understand what it's been like for me. I was left to pick up the pieces when you walked out." "Chris," she paused, feeling the weight of his name on her tongue. "Chris was there when I had no one. He didn't just fill the void you left. He became a father to them." David winced, visibly affected by her words. I know I messed up, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But Chris can't be their father, Emily. I am. Emily's jaw clenched, her anger bubbling to the surface. You weren't their father when I needed you most, she shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. You weren't there when they took their first steps, when they said their first words. You don't just get to show up and claim that title now. David's face fell, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. Instead, he sat down on the couch, burying his head in his hands. I've had so much time to think about everything I did wrong, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I'd never get a second chance. And now that I'm here, I just want to do whatever I can to make it up to you and to them. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but please, give me a chance to be their dad. The sincerity in his voice made Emily's chest tighten, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain of the past. She glanced at her children again, knowing they deserved the chance to know their father. But at what cost? The thought of Chris filled her mind. He had been a constant presence in their lives, and his gentle kindness had been the foundation upon which Emily had rebuilt her world. Losing him now felt unthinkable. Chris had been more than just a friend, more than just someone who helped when times were tough. He had been her partner in every way that mattered. And yet, she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge how much she needed him until she had seen him walk out the door. David, sensing her hesitation, looked up at her with pleading eyes. Emily, I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not the man I used to be. I just want to be here, even if that means we take things slow. Emily stared at him, feeling the weight of his words settle in her mind. She knew that David had changed, at least he appeared to have, but change wasn't enough to heal the wounds he had caused. Still, her children deserved a relationship with their father. She couldn't deny them that. I don't know what the right answer is, Emily admitted, her voice softer now, tinged with exhaustion. But the kids deserve to know you, and you need to be consistent. You can't just drop in and out of their lives like you did with mine. David nodded solemnly. I swear, I won't disappear again. I'll be here for them, no matter what. Emily sighed, her head spinning. This was only the beginning of the complex situation she found herself in, but it wasn't something she could resolve tonight. She needed space, and most of all, she needed to talk to Chris. David, I need some time to process all of this, she said finally. You can see the kids, but we need to set some boundaries. I'll let you know when you can come by. David stood up, a look of gratitude crossing his face. Thank you, Emily, he said quietly. I appreciate it more than you know. Without another word, he gave Noah one last glance, then turned and left the house, leaving Emily standing in the quiet stillness once again. As the door closed behind him, the reality of the situation hit her with full force. She was at a crossroads, one path leading her toward a reconciliation with her past, and the other pulling her toward the future she had begun to build with Chris. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized that her decision wasn't just about choosing between David and Chris. It was about reclaiming her life. For so long, she had let herself be defined by the men in her world, by David's abandonment and by Chris's unwavering support. But now, she needed to figure out who she was outside of them. Emily walked over to the couch, sinking down into the cushions as her thoughts spiraled. She had spent so much time healing from David's betrayal that she hadn't allowed herself to truly imagine what a future without him, or with him, would look like. Chris had been her rock, but could she truly move forward with him when she hadn't fully resolved her feelings for David? Was it fair to Chris, or to herself? Just as these thoughts began to overwhelm her, there was another knock at the door. Emily's heart skipped a beat, hoping it wasn't David again. But when she opened the door, she found Chris standing there, looking hesitant and unsure. I didn't mean to storm out earlier, Chris said softly, his hands shoved into his pockets. I didn't know what to say. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Chris, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to walk into that. Chris nodded, but his eyes held a sadness that Emily hadn't seen before. I get it, Emily. He's their dad. I don't have any right to come between that. His words pierced through her, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure how to respond. "But you're important to them too, Chris," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've been here for us when no one else was. You've been more of a father to them than David ever was." Chris looked away, his jaw clenched. "But I'm not their father, Emily. I'm just a guy who helps out when things get tough." "That's not true," Emily protested, stepping closer to him. "You're more than that. To me, to the kids, you're family." Chris finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and pain. "What are you saying, Emily?" "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't imagine my life without you. You've become such an important part of our lives, and I—" Chris held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Emily, you don't have to say anything right now. I know you're dealing with a lot. I just want you to know that whatever happens with David, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Emily felt tears well up in her eyes. She had spent so much time being afraid of being hurt again, afraid of opening her heart to someone else, that she hadn't realized how much Chris had come to mean to her. And now, standing in front of him, she felt the depth of her feelings rise to the surface. "I'm scared, Chris," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of making the wrong choice." Chris stepped forward, gently cupping her face in his hands. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together." Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her emotions. The fear, the uncertainty, but also the love and gratitude she had for the man standing in front of her. But as comforting as Chris's presence was, Emily knew that the road ahead was anything but clear. She still had unresolved feelings for David, and she wasn't sure how to navigate the complexities of their co-parenting relationship. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. All she knew was that she wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to give her the strength she needed to face whatever came next. As the night stretched on, Emily stood at the crossroads of her past and her future, knowing that whichever path she chose, it would change her life forever. The days following Chris's visit were a blur of emotions for Emily. She felt like a pendulum, swinging between the life she had built and the one that had been shattered by David's departure. Each day brought new revelations, new moments of clarity and confusion, as her heart wrestled with a decision that seemed impossible to make. David had been texting regularly, checking in on the triplets, asking when he could see them again. His messages were respectful, careful not to overstep, but each one was a reminder of the unresolved feelings between them. The children didn't yet understand who David was, though they seemed drawn to him during his brief visits. Emily watched as David knelt to their level, trying to make up for lost time, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their bond, fractured by his absence, would never be as natural as it might have been. Then there was Chris. He had given Emily space after their conversation, not pressing her for answers, though she could sense the uncertainty in his eyes when they saw each other. He still came by to help with the children, and though they kept things light, there was an unspoken tension between them. The easy comfort they had shared before had been replaced by something more fragile, something waiting to either shatter or solidify. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Emily decided to take the triplets to the park. The fresh air and open space always calmed her, and she hoped it would help clear her mind. As Noah, Isaiah, and Layla toddled off to explore the playground, Emily found herself sitting alone on a bench, watching them with a bittersweet smile. She had always imagined raising her children in a home filled with stability, love, and a partner who shared every milestone with her. Instead, life had handed her something far more complicated, a tangled mess of love, betrayal, and two men whose roles in her life were more intertwined than she could handle. As she sat there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a message from David. "Can I see the kids later today? I've been thinking a lot. I really want to talk to you about where we go from here." Emily stared at the screen, feeling the familiar knot in her stomach. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. She was about to reply when her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Chris. "I've been thinking about you. If you need anything, I'm here." Juxtaposition of their messages felt like a cruel joke. Two men, both claiming space in her heart, both waiting for her to make a decision that would change everything. She felt the pressure building, as if the walls were closing in around her, forcing her to confront what she had been avoiding for weeks. Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She couldn't keep delaying the inevitable. She needed to have that conversation with David, and she needed to figure out where her heart truly lay. That evening, after the triplets were in bed, Emily invited David over to talk. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she heard his footsteps approaching the door. The familiar sound of his knock sent a wave of nostalgia washing over her. Memories of the life they had once shared before everything had fallen apart. David entered the room cautiously, his expression tentative. He glanced around, taking in a house that was once his, now filled with signs of a life that had moved on without him. Chris's jacket hanging on the chair, the kids' toys scattered across the floor. "Thanks for letting me come by," David said quietly as he sat down across from her. Emily nodded, trying to steady her nerves. "We need to talk," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. David leaned forward, his gaze intense but full of remorse. "I know I've asked a lot from you since I came back, and I know I don't have the right to ask for more, but I want to make things work, Emily, not just with the kids, but with us." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I know I hurt you," David went on, his voice thick with emotion, "but I've had 2 years to think about what I lost. You, the kids. I've been through therapy, I've worked on myself, and I realized that what I did was the biggest mistake of my life. Leaving you, abandoning our family. I can't make up for that, but I want to try. I want to be the man you deserve." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Emily felt the pull of old memories, the love they had shared, the dreams they had built together before everything had gone wrong. But those memories were stained with the pain of his betrayal, the night she had cried alone, wondering how he could leave her at her most vulnerable. "You can't just say you've changed and expect everything to go back to the way it was," Emily said finally, her voice shaking with the weight of her emotions. "You left me, David. You left when I needed you the most. And now, after all this time, you expect me to just forget that? To forgive you?" David's face crumpled with regret, and for the first time, Emily saw how deeply his guilt had eaten away at him. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he said softly. "I know I have to earn that, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Emily swallowed hard, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She had spent so long rebuilding her life, learning to stand on her own 2 feet. And in that process, Chris had come into her life, not just as a friend, but as someone who had shown her what real love and partnership could look like. Chris. His name echoed in her mind, grounding her in the present. "There's someone else," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chris, he's been there for me, and the kids when you weren't. He's become a part of our lives." David's face fell, but he didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. "I figured there might be someone else," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "And I get it. I have no right to ask for anything from you. But I love you, Emily. I've always loved you." Emily blinked back tears, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had loved David once, with all her heart, but the man sitting in front of her now felt like a stranger. And while his return had stirred old feelings, she couldn't ignore the fact that Chris had been there when David hadn't. "David, I don't know if I can ever trust you again," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "I spent so long trying to pick up the pieces after you left, and Chris, he's been the one who's helped me. He's been the one who's shown up." David looked down, the reality of her words sinking in. He had lost so much time, and now it seemed like time was slipping away from him again. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'm not giving up on us. I'm going to be here for the kids, no matter what. And if you ever find it in your heart to give me another chance, I'll be waiting." Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she watched as David stood up and made his way to the door. For the second time that night, she watched him leave, her heart torn between the past and the present. After he left, Emily sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where David had just been. She felt drained, emotionally exhausted from the weight of her decision. But as she sat there, a sense of clarity began to emerge. Chris wasn't just a crutch she had leaned on during difficult times. He had become the man she could rely on, the man who had shown her what love could be, steady, patient, and unwavering. David's return had stirred up old feelings, but those feelings were tied to a version of him that no longer existed. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by someone who had been broken by his own mistakes. Emily took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that had fallen unnoticed. The crossroads she had been standing at for so long now felt less daunting. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure: she had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had been abandoned and broken. She was stronger now, more self-assured, and more aware of what she needed in her life. And what she needed wasn't a man from her past trying to make amends for old mistakes. It was the man who had stood by her side through it all, the man who had loved her without condition. Chris. It was time to talk to him, to tell him what was in her heart, before it was too late. The next morning, Emily woke up with a newfound clarity. For the first time in months, she felt like she was no longer suffocating under the weight of indecision. Her conversation with David the night before had stirred up emotions she thought she had buried, but it had also given her a sense of closure. The man she had once loved was gone, and while he was now trying to make amends, their relationship was beyond repair. The real question now was what she was going to do about Chris. He had been patient, giving her the space she needed, but Emily knew she couldn't leave him hanging any longer. He deserved the truth. He deserved to know where her heart really lay. With a deep breath, Emily got out of bed and dressed, moving quietly around the house so as not to wake the triplets. Today, she would make things right. After breakfast, she called Chris and asked him to meet her at the park, the same place where she had taken the kids only a few days earlier. It seemed fitting to have this conversation in a place where life felt simple, where she could think clearly and feel the pull of her heart. When Chris arrived, Emily was already sitting on the same bench she had been on during her last visit. She watched as he approached, his hands in his pockets, his expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. The sight of him stirred something deep within her, something that had been growing ever since they first became close. He had been her rock, her anchor in the storm, and now it was time to acknowledge what had been building between them. Chris sat down beside her, leaving a small but noticeable distance between them. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said softly. "What's going on?" Emily turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She could see the concern in his eyes, the gentle worry that maybe this was the moment where she would tell him she had chosen David. But that wasn't what she had called him here for. "I've been thinking a lot," Emily began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "About everything. About you, about David, about the kids, and about what I want for my future." Chris nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "And what did you figure out?" Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she continued. "David's return brought up a lot of old feelings. It forced me to confront things I thought I'd moved past. But after everything, I realized something important." Chris's eyes softened, his expression hopeful yet cautious. "What's that?" "That I'm not that same person anymore," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I've changed. I've become someone who knows what she wants and what I deserve. And what I've realized is that the life I want, the person I want to share that life with is you, Chris." Chris blinked, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Emily, are you sure? I don't want you to feel like you have to choose me just because of—" "I'm choosing you," Emily interrupted gently, reaching out to take his hand. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." You've been there for me in ways that David never was, and I can't keep pretending that what we have isn't real. You've been more than a friend, more than a father to the kids. You've become the person I trust with my heart." Chris looked down at their joined hands, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. When he looked back up at her, his eyes were filled with emotion, relief, love, and something deeper. "I've loved you for a long time, Emily," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I didn't want to pressure you. I wanted you to come to me when you were ready." "I'm ready now," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper as her heart swelled with the truth of her words. "And I don't want to wait any longer." Chris let out a breath he had been holding, a smile breaking across his face. It was the kind of smile that made Emily's heart flutter, the one that told her she had made the right decision. He leaned forward slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid that the moment might shatter if he moved too quickly. Emily closed the gap between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that felt like the culmination of everything they had been through together. It wasn't rushed or desperate, but filled with a deep sense of certainty, of finally stepping into the future she had been too scared to claim. When they pulled apart, Chris rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I love you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too," Emily replied, the words spilling from her lips with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. For a long moment, they sat there in the quiet of the park, the weight of their shared feelings settling between them. The future wasn't clear, and Emily knew there would still be challenges ahead. Co-parenting with David, navigating the complicated emotions that linger from their past. None of that would be easy, but with Chris by her side, she felt like she could handle anything. Later that day, Emily made the difficult but necessary call to David. She didn't want to lead him on or give him false hope. They needed to co-parent, but she had to set firm boundaries, both for her sake and for Chris's. David answered after a few rings, his voice tentative. "Hey, Emily." "Hi, David," she replied, her heart heavy with the conversation ahead. "I wanted to talk to you about where we go from here." There was a pause on the other end, and Emily could almost hear the weight of expectation in his silence. "Okay," David said finally. "What's on your mind?" Emily took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about us and about the kids. And while I want you to have a relationship with them, I think it's important that we're clear about where we stand." David was silent for a moment, and Emily could hear the faint sound of him exhaling on the other end. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. "You've made your choice." "I have," Emily said, her voice soft but firm. "Chris is the person I want to be with, but I want us to figure out a way to co-parent for the sake of the kids." David didn't argue. He had already seen the writing on the wall. "I get it," he said, his voice laced with disappointment, but also acceptance. "I'll be there for the kids, Emily. I'm not going to disappear again." "I appreciate that," Emily replied, her heart aching for the man he had once been, but relieved to finally close this chapter of her life. As she hung up the phone, Emily felt a sense of finality wash over her. The past would always be a part of her, but she was no longer bound by it. She had made her choice, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of quiet joy and growing intimacy between her and Chris. They fell into an easy rhythm, one that felt natural and right. The triplets adored Chris, and as the days passed, they began calling him Daddy, a title he accepted with love and pride. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily looked over at Chris, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "All the time," Chris replied, his hand gently rubbing her back. "And every time I do, you and the kids are in it." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I feel the same way." The future wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but Emily knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen the man who had stood by her through thick and thin, the man who loved her and her children unconditionally. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emily leaned into Chris's embrace, feeling the warmth of his love surround her. She had finally found her new beginning, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future she had never thought possible. And this time, she knew she wasn't walking into that future alone.